There are a lot of sacred texts in Hinduism. I mean, it's way too much to read. But as I was saying earlier, amongst the earliest are the Vedas. And the Vedas come out about 1000 BCE to about 500 BCE, around there. The earliest of which, as I was saying before, is the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda, as I was saying, seems to have its origins in the Iranian plateau because of the gods and the other details in the Rig Veda. You're also on my way, pressed out for Indra in his drink. Flow onward with thy juice onto the banquets of the mighty gods. Flow hither for our strength and fame, thy soul that is flowing forth, primeval soul sacrifice. Soma. Now, as the Vedas go on in time, as we get closer to the modern era, they become more philosophical and deal with issues that arose around the time of Buddhism and Jainism, which will come out of the Indian subcontinent. So you can see a progression going through the Vedas as you go from the earliest to the newest Vedas. You see sort of, let's say, more almost animistic beginnings of polytheism, very ritualistic and worship of forces of nature and stuff like that, to more philosophical writings. As I'm going to argue in my paper, there seems to be a small insertion in an early Veda that does not seem to belong there. It seems to be like somebody took a later writing and inserted it into an earlier writing to sort of justify something that comes later. But that's getting ahead of myself. That's what I argue in my paper. Amongst other Hindu writings is the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is immensely epic. It's a very long story, perhaps the longest story from human history, perhaps. It is said that the Mahabharata is 10 times the length of Homer's Odyssey, or his Iliad and his Odyssey put together times 10 will be the size of the Mahabharata. Now, the Mahabharata is very long. It doesn't really matter for the point of this video, and you don't need to understand the Mahabharata to understand Hinduism at all. But you do have to understand that the Bhagavad Gita is actually part of the Mahabharata. Thankfully, the Bhagavad Gita can be read in and of itself. You don't need to know the Mahabharata or the backstory of the Bhagavad Gita. It's pretty simple, as you'll see. Alright, so the Bhagavad Gita starts off on a battlefield. The world's two largest armies are face to face. In a chariot, the leader of one army is Arjuna. Arjuna is supposed to blow his conch horn to start the battle off, to start the charge of his army. But he has, before the beginning of this battle, what I'm going to call a sort of Abraham crisis, or I'm going to call an Abraham moment. And you'll see why I call it an Abraham moment in a moment. So Arjuna is there, and he is he's both the leader of his army, and he's also an archer. And his friend and charioteer is Krishna, who he thinks is just a human. But we'll get into that in a moment. Arjuna looks at the two armies, the two greatest armies in the world, and because of the backstory that we don't need to know, he sees that it's going to be brothers against brothers and cousins against fathers, etc. And he realizes that this just seems so wrong. I mean, it seems so pointless and so senseless to go ahead with this army, even though it has to do with honor and other convoluted things. He just realizes how pointless it is. Now, I call this an Abraham moment because this is the kind of story where, because of natural human ethics, I would argue, you read it and you start to go, yeah, all right, I think I know where this is going to go. But then the story turns around and does 180 on you, and then you become horrified. Because what happens is Krishna, first of all, reveals that he is actually a god. He is an avatar of Vishnu. Vishnu, as you remember, is one of the gods of Hinduism. Every so often, Vishnu will have an avatar. That is, he will put himself into a body. He will incarnate himself into the world to perform some sort of task. Amongst the most famous avatars would be Rama of the Ramayana story, and Krishna. But he's also taken on some other forms, like a giant boar, I believe, and some sort of lion-headed god that kicks ass and rips people's guts out and stuff like that. But anyway, Krishna reveals to Arjuna that he's not just his friend and his chariot driver, but also a god, an avatar of Vishnu, and not just a god, but the supreme god. We'll get into that later. And what he does is he basically tells Arjuna that he actually should go ahead with the battle as planned, even though it's going to mean violence, apparently senseless violence. In fact, this senselessness or the pointlessness of this battle is almost the point, or kind of the point, that it has to be that way. Krishna tells Arjuna two different things. One is that everybody should be obeying the caste system. As a member of the Kshatriya caste, or the warrior caste, Arjuna, it's his duty to fight. Number two is that no action is bad action if you're doing it according to the Dharma, or the sacred law of the universe, which involves basically obeying the role of the caste system. So that's going to be my first point of paper that I contend against. Second thing is that whatever action you're doing, you have to sort of hold this devotional worship of Krishna in your mind as you're doing it. Over time, your actions will become closer and closer to perfection. But now keep in mind that it is a metaphor, but it's also to be taken literally in this story, that Krishna is telling Arjuna, a warrior, that since you are a warrior and you are part of this warrior caste, it's your duty to go ahead and fight. And so most of the Bhagavad Gita is basically this conversation that Krishna has with Arjuna before the battle. It's a very long conversation. It is actually very philosophical in nature, however flawed it might be. And basically, Krishna explains the law of Dharma, why you should follow the caste system, and by following the caste system, you live out good karma, and why Krishna himself is supreme. At one point, Krishna enacts a theophany. In other words, he reveals his divine nature to Arjuna in a very psychedelic scene in the Bhagavad Gita. It's actually pretty cool.
I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds. Everything emanates from me. The wise who perfectly know this engage in my devotional service and worship me with all their hearts. My opulences, hundreds of thousands of varied, divine, and multicolored forms. Behold the many wonderful things which no one has ever seen or heard before. O Arjuna, whatever you wish to see, behold at once in this body of mine. This universal form can show you whatever you now desire to see and whatever you may want to see in the future. Everything, moving and non-moving, is completely in one place. But you cannot see me with your present eyes. Therefore I give you divine eyes. Behold my mystic opulence. Arjuna saw in that universal form unlimited mouths, unlimited eyes, unlimited wonderful visions, The form was decorated with many celestial ornaments and bore many divine upraised weapons. He wore celestial garlands and garments, and many divine scents were smeared over his body. All was wondrous, brilliant, unlimited, and all-expanding. If hundreds of thousands of suns were to rise at once into the sky, their radiance might resemble the effulgence of the Supreme Person in that universal form. Arjuna becomes overwhelmed by it all, and Krishna returns himself to his human form once again.
And so after this long philosophical, transcendental, mystical dissertation by Krishna, he basically convinces Arjuna in the end to go ahead with this battle, because everything is as it should be. In other words. Now I'm going to argue in my paper implicitly, but I'll say explicitly here, is that due to its overwhelming influence on people in India with its caste system, the Bhagavad Gita is pretty detrimental to society, as you will see.